This is the first one, and there's a couple reasons for having these. One, it allows all of us, especially since we're from different backgrounds, to see what everyone is, or what each person is doing, and possibly have some ideas for collaboration and working together on future projects. It's also an opportunity, we are filming these so we can use them promotionally if we want. To put on our website, have our research forum page or something like that. And so then also there were a couple ideas for students. So in the future, when you're talking to students about coming to these, they're good for students because if they want to do any research, it's good experience for them to see somebody standing up talking about their research, and then possibly more importantly, answering questions if anyone has questions or comments, how they stand up to those. And then also, I was telling my students, if you're not interested in research at all, at some point you're going to have to do an interview of some sort, or you're going to have to do a presentation of some sort. And so it's good experience to come and see your professors doing the same thing. Maybe it'll put them a little more ease. So as we continue and hopefully grow this, those are some of the things that we can be telling our students. So the first portion of these will be a presentation from one of the faculty members, and then as we grow, we have the opportunity to bring in outside people if we want to talk about things that they are doing. Then second, after the presentation, we had originally planned we were going to have 2 faculty present each time, but then talking with Dong-hee, Rayma, and Carol about how we should do this, we kind of came up with this idea that, well, let's leave the second portion of this sort of as a roundtable discussion. And so the roundtable discussion after the presentation will just be, what is everyone doing currently, or things that you just finished, or ideas that you have. Maybe it'll help to foster a little bit of discussion and collaboration amongst all of us. So I will go ahead, since this is the first one, I volunteered to present. So I will go ahead and start my presentation. Are there any questions about what we're planning to do? Yeah, I know it has to. Oops. There we go. All right, we're good. So, as everyone probably knows, my research deals with Rivalry. I've worked with a few people in here on different projects looking at Rivalry, and primarily I'm concerned with how fans react to the rivalry phenomenon and how that phenomenon impacts their behavior toward their favorite team and their behavior toward their rival teams. So these are open to the individual speaker kind of deciding what they want to talk about, if they want to talk about a specific study or just an overview. I'm just giving a general overview of some of the things that I've done so far and some of the things that I am planning to do in the future. So first, what is rivalry? Well, here's a very long definition that we came up with and we validated during the dissertation process. And so we looked at an adversarial group, and we looked at between teams, players, fans, and then we tried to go through and talk about how these can gain significance. And they can gain significance through on-field or off-field competition, historical occurrences, proximity, and there are other researchers who have in some ways added to the characteristics or the antecedents of rivalry. So here's the definition of rivalry, but what is it really? Really, when we're talking about rivalry, and the way that I look at it, is it's really a study of how individuals and groups interact. So at the very basic level, it doesn't have anything to do with sport when you look at how individuals and how groups are behaving, and I'll talk about something a little bit later that we're doing in the political realm as well. And so my research is very psychology based. I use a lot of psychology literature to drive the theories that I use. And so really, if you're taking this out of the sport realm and just thinking in more general terms, it's how people are interacting with one another and how those interactions impact us throughout our lives. So why do I research Rivalry? It's actually for a very, it started at a very personal experience or personal level. So 2008, I had just moved to Colorado, and the Texas Longhorns were ranked in the top 5 that year. And they played the Oklahoma Sooners in their annual Red River Rivalry game, and they actually beat the Oklahoma Sooners on the field. And so from that, the Longhorns, I think, were number 1 in the nation at one point, but they lost a game later in the season to Texas Tech on Michael Crabtree's final seconds catch. And so it ended where Oklahoma, Texas, and Texas Tech all had one loss at the end of the season. And so at that time, the Big 12 tiebreaker, they had to go 5 different tiebreakers to determine which team from the Big 12 South was going to represent that division in the conference championship. And it came down to BCS rankings, and Oklahoma beat out Texas in BCS rankings by a very, very thin margin. They went on, played in the conference championship, won handily. They ended up going and playing in the national championship, and they were playing the Florida Gators. And I remember watching that game, feeling that I wanted Florida to win the game. And I thought, well, why do I want Florida to win the game? I have no affiliation with Florida, besides having gone to the state a few times and liking Mickey Mouse. And then it dawned on me about halfway through the game, it's not that I really like Florida. I could care less if they won the next year. I just don't want Oklahoma to win. So I started thinking, why don't I want Oklahoma to win? Well, could it be because Texas beat them and I thought Texas should have been there? Could it be because Oklahoma is my biggest rival, and if they win, then they're experiencing success and Texas isn't experiencing some type of direct success? And so I started thinking, well, if I'm feeling this way, there are other people that are feeling this way as well. And we've all seen the shirts that say, my favorite team is whatever your favorite team is, and whoever's playing my biggest rival. We've all seen those shirts. So I started thinking, other people have to be feeling this way. And so at that time, I was going into the first summer of my doctoral program, and I was doing a qualitative class. And so I started the interview process looking at how people reacted to their favorite teams and how they reacted to the rival teams, both in success and failure situations. And so now, I'll kind of take a step back and look at the theoretical basis of rivalry that I've used. When I started researching this, there was very little research in sport rivalry. There was research outside of sport, in advertising and sibling rivalry, and even in military warfare. And so all of those pieces of work are what I was having to use for the dissertation. And so here's kind of the framework I followed as far as the theories that I found that were helpful to me. So competition and comparison just says that when we're competing against someone else, we're going to try harder because we want to compare favorably to someone else. Social identity is those groups that we identify with that impacts or that tells something about us, and so we choose groups accordingly. Collective identity is when you actually start to take on the characteristics of the group. And in-group bias, linguistic in-group bias, and the rest down here is really where you get into how people treat out-group members. So you have your in-group people that have similar characteristics to you, and then you have your out-group. And in-group bias says you're going to treat people in your group better than you do people outside of your group. And that makes sense, right? It's you think on many different levels within sport and outside of sport. You see what's going on right now in the political realm, and you look at how the two different parties treat the candidate of the other party, and in some instances treat supporters of those candidates. Linguistic in-group bias says that we will describe actions of our in-group members in a way that, if it's positive, reflects on our group. If it's negative, we push that action away and we say that person's a lone wolf or something. That's not representative of our group. However, if that person is in the out group of ours, then if they do something well, then it's an anomaly. People in that group typically don't do that. If they do something negative, then we stereotype the whole group based on that. And then Schadenfreude is an old German term meaning we take pleasure in the demise of someone else. And then disposition of mirth, sport disposition theory built on Schadenfreude. And it basically says that we're happy when someone we like is successful and when someone we dislike is unsuccessful. And so just a couple more things. I mentioned people working on some more antecedents and characteristics and what causes rivalry, what causes the phenomenon. People had also looked at fan behavior and how people evaluate fan behavior of rival teams before I had started. And then here's some work on Schadenfreude in sport where psychologists were able to use MMRs and find out that people, their brain waves, they reacted differently when their favorite team was successful and then when their favorite team wasn't successful, and differently when a rival team was unsuccessful when they weren't playing their favorite team. And so the favorite team wasn't involved, they were still happy. Rivalry can impact consumption, so Mahoney and Moorman found that NBA fans were more likely to watch a game that their rival team was playing in that didn't involve their favorite team if they thought the rival team was likely to lose. So they wanted to have that level of enjoyment from seeing indirect failure. And then it can also impact sponsorship and the way that we consume products of our favorite teams. So quickly, here's the methods that I use to research rivalry. I use quantitative more, but because sport rivalry is relatively new, it's very important to use the qualitative methods as well. And whether it's following up some quantitative data or supporting the need to collect some quantitative data. And then here are some of the ways I've used quantitative and qualitative, so online or in-person surveys, and then interviews, and some of the more interesting parts or some of the more interesting methods I use is looking at message boards and how people describe each other on message boards. We'll get to that a little bit later. And just before I get into some of the studies that I have done, here's what I believe about rivalry. First, the fan is the most important. So the fan is who identifies a rival team, and they're really who drives a rival team. And so later on, we'll talk about some of the practical implications of rivalry, and that's going to build off of this idea that the fan is the most important. And then fans can differ on their rivals. So I can feel Oklahoma is a rival of my favorite team, Texas, whereas someone else, another friend can feel that Texas A&M is a rival of Texas. So we can differ on that, and it doesn't matter because it all is based on the fans. And then, as I said, the way that we perceive and interpret rivals can influence many aspects of our fan experience. So I mentioned the interviews that I had done at Northern Colorado, and they really led into these two studies. This first, Laureate of Reflective Failure, was the qualitative piece where I asked people, how will you socialize to your favorite team? How will you socialize to your rival team? So how did you know who your rival team was? And then how do you react or how do you feel when your favorite team or rival team is successful or unsuccessful? And a really interesting aspect of that was I asked how you feel when your rival team is unsuccessful in an indirect competitive setting. And some people said they experienced joy from that. And there were varying levels of that, but that's where Laureate of Reflective Failure came from. So it's the competition aspect of Schadenfreude. When there's competition between two groups, then Gorfing is activated and people take pleasure when that out-group is unsuccessful. Another thing I did from that was develop a sport rivalry fan perception skill. And I did that because there was nothing I could use that existed to measure fan or how fans felt about rivalry. And so I used the information I got from the qualitative interviews and from a original list of about 150 statements, went through a validation process and ended up with a 12-item scale that measures out-group indirect competition, so how willing are you to support your rival when they're playing someone else. Out-group academic prestige, which is really just a measure of prestige of the overall rival. Because believe it or not, I had people say, I know nothing about the academics at my rival institution, but it can't be as good as the academics at my favorite team. Which backs up something Cialdini did in the 80s when they asked people to describe characteristics of their university and another comparable university, and people described their university more favorably. Also, out-group sportsmanship, because most people feel that rival fans behave very poorly and ignore the fact that some favorite team fans can behave very poorly as well. Again, that distancing the favorite team fan misbehavior or bad behavior, and then really taking on the rival team fan behavior. And then the last was sense of satisfaction. How excited are you when your favorite team beats your rival team in direct competition? So I really, using the SRFPS, that's really what's led the rest of my research pretty much up to this point. And so here are just 3 things that use the SRFPS. One, we looked at conferences, and very interestingly, we had enough data where we could look at the 5 power conferences and compare rival perceptions between those conferences. And so one really interesting finding from that was we're in SEC country, and everyone is always talking about how SEC fans support other SEC teams, right? We hear the chants SEC, SEC at the end of big time games when an SEC team is going to win. Well, what we actually found was when it comes to your most heated rival or your biggest rival, that's not the case. The fans were significantly less likely to support their biggest rival against another team than fans in any other conference in the United States. And then we also found some differences in academic prestige as far as fans in the ACC felt the academic prestige of their rival was significantly greater or more positive than the academic prestige of fans in other conferences. Here's something that's in press right now where we were looking at how the introduction of a new team, a football team in this instance, can impact existing rivalries for other sports within an athletics department. And then this one's kind of a fun one that just came out about how the way people feel about rival teams and players actually impacts the way who they select to draft in fantasy football and who they're playing from week to week in fantasy football. So it's not always just who's going to get me the most points. There is that little bit of tug about, this team was on a rival when they were in college, or they played for a rival team. Now, I may not want to draft them. Something interesting happened on the way to the dissertation, conference realignment. And I'll just briefly show you, it all started with Colorado choosing to leave the Big 12 to go to the Pac-10, followed by Boise State. Nebraska left the Big 12 to go to the Big 10. Utah went to the Pac-12. Plethora of other schools started adding. TCU is very interesting because TCU left the Mountain West to go to the Big East, and then before they even played a game in the Big East, Texas A&M had left the Big 12 to go to the SEC, so TCU left the Big East to join the Big 12. That West Virginia didn't join the Big 12, and that essentially forced Missouri's hand to make the decision to leave the Big 12 and go to the SEC. And then a plethora of other schools joined the Conference USA, and Memphis finally gets into the Big East, and then the Big East folds, and now we're in the American Athletic. Pretty ridiculous, right? We're not even halfway there yet. Between 2010 and 2013, over 40 schools switched athletic conferences. Now, why this is important for what I study is when these teams that have switched conferences, they have to find new teams to identify as rivals in their new conferences because they want to use an opposing team to market their on-field product and have their engage their fans, get their fans excited about coming to games. However, Other teams that didn't switch conferences were also impacted. For example, look at Texas A&M. They had a over 100-year rivalry with the University of Texas. All of a sudden, they're not playing that Thanksgiving night or after Thanksgiving game. So Texas has to find another team to identify as their big rival to play that game. And so virtually every team or every school was impacted by conference realignment. And so from that, some things that we did, and Tim worked on this one with me, there was a quantitative piece to this where we asked people their rival perceptions of the current rival. So this was before the teams had left their conferences. So who's your biggest rival in the Big 12? And then you're joining the SEC. Who do you think is going to be your biggest rival in the SEC? And we asked their perceptions of those rival teams, and we compared the two. And we found that people were more negative toward their current rival than the anticipated rival, which makes sense. We also asked some questions measuring people's likelihood to consider anonymous aggression toward participants and fans of a rival team. People were more likely to consider anonymous aggression toward their current rival than their anticipated rival, again, which makes sense. Then there was also a qualitative piece. And really what we found from that, one of the biggest findings was we have an inherent need for rivalry because we want that competition. We want to be able to compare favorably against someone. So when we lose an out group, we're going to find another out group to identify against. And so fans have the need for rivalry, and we'll do whatever we need to do to find another when our rival leaves. This first works in progress is a follow-up to that original conference realignment paper. And so in this one, it was 3 years later, 3 or 4 seasons later, that teams have been playing in the new conference. And so we just revisited, and we asked people, Texas A&M fans, we said, okay, now you're in the SEC, so who's your biggest rival in the SEC? You were in the Big 12, so who was your biggest rival in the Big 12? And we asked their perceptions of those teams again, and we compared them again. And what we found was really interesting, that fans of teams that had changed conferences, when it came to on-field competition issues or characteristics such as sense of satisfaction when your favorite team beats your rival, or willingness to support the rival in indirect competition, that wasn't changed. That went unchanged. People were still more negative toward their former rival than they were their current rival. However, those off-the-field issues, such as fan sportsmanship and academic prestige, they were more negative toward their current rival than their former rival. And so what that suggests is 3 or 4 seasons playing each other doesn't a rivalry make, especially, but people are trying. They're trying to move on. And so when we do this again in another 3 or 4 seasons, are we going to see something slightly different? Now, we did ask the anonymous aggression questions again, and people were still more likely to consider anonymous aggression toward their former rival than their current rival. So that was another aspect of this. And another really cool thing we did with this study is we had enough fans from schools like Texas A&M, Missouri, and TCU in the 2013 study, and then in this 2016 study. So we actually compared their findings from 2013 to 2016 to see if a Texas A&M fan, their perceptions changed regarding Texas before conference realignment and after conference realignment. We did the same thing for Missouri and TCU, and overall we saw no differences. So again, if you're a practitioner, what this means is if your team switches a conference, you have to allow for a certain number of time, or you can't expect a new rivalry to be born right away and fans to latch onto that rivalry. Here's something that we're looking at, how rival perceptions impacts that glory out of reflective failure. We developed a quantitative measure of that. So how much joy do you get when your rival team loses to someone else? How do rival team perceptions impact that? And then also, how do rival team perceptions and gorfing impact your likelihood to consume your favorite team? Because that's something that would be really interesting if we could, for the future, if we could show that this has a significant impact on how a person consumes their favorite team. So if my rival team loses, I'm more likely to wear a shirt of my favorite team, or I'm more likely to purchase a shirt of my favorite team. That has strong theoretical implications, but it has huge practical implications for administrators. And then the final one I'll talk about on here is something that Hutch and I are working on that's in review now, looking at rivalry in professional sport, because the work I've done so far has been in intercollegiate sport, so we want to look at this in professional sport. Another thing that I do kind of to inform the public, and it's something fun to do with, and I have my grad students and some of my master's students working on it, is I run sportrivalry.com. And so we have historical records on there. We have podcasts of specific rivalries. So Yale, Harvard, Texas, Oklahoma, Texas A&M, LSU. And then this is a place that I see this website as a place where students who are doing reports for school can go, and this is a reputable place where they can pull data and they can pull information. But some of the really interesting things that we have posted on sportrivalry.com is, as of now, or as of 2 years ago, I had 2,500 data points. And a data point was just a fan indicating who their rival was. That was treated as a data point. So we had a large enough sample where we could start to combine some of these, and we could start to look at some of the practical implications for these. And so we asked people, we looked at the number of rivals that fans identified. And so up here you can see Syracuse fans identified 11 different teams as a rival over the last 3 or 4 years. But Nebraska fans, 9, Arizona 8, West Virginia and Wisconsin 7 different fans. These schools that are in red are no longer playing in their conference. And so this is just further evidence for practitioners that when your team switches a conference, you can't expect your fans to completely change their and identify against another rival and automatically get excited about that rival. They're going to hold on to some of those old rivalries as well. We also looked at the number of rivals per conference, just because this was pretty interesting. People typically think of the Big Ten as the rival conference, and there are so many different rivalry trophies. So I just wanted to look at this, and the Big 12 is actually a slightly higher average of rival per team. So when we looked at how many people identified different teams as rivals, we also flipped that around and said, we looked at how many people identified a certain team as a rival. And so the Longhorns were top. They had 11 different teams' fans identify them as a rival. And then next you have Duke, Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State all at 7. What's really interesting about this is this has strong practical implications. And actually in marketing yesterday, we were just talking about what ratings say about brand strength. And so this is another indicator of brand strength. You think about with companies like Apple, when they put out a new iPhone, other companies are trying to put out commercials in some way to put down the iPhone and be favorably compared to the iPhone. And so the more companies that are trying to compare themselves to you, that says something about your brand strength. And so that has a lot of practical implications. Same thing, there's a similar study on college campuses and how many colleges are comparing themselves to you, to other institutions. And then finally on the website, we just looked at the most intense fan rivalries. And so I just took an aggregate score of the people's scores on the Sport Rivalry Fan Perception Scale. And so they could score, the highest they could score was at 84. And so basically what I did is, this is just looking at Arizona fans and Arizona State fans. They're comparing or averaging out their aggregate score for the SRFBS. And so interestingly, we find that Arizona State is the most intense fan rivalry. In this part of the country, people don't really know that. We don't really, and people probably don't agree with that. people would think it was actually probably Alabama-Auburn. And you see that's number 4 on the list, behind Kansas, Missouri, and Nebraska, Colorado, which no longer exist. Excuse me. However, this is the 3rd time that Arizona State has come out on top when people have used data to measure intensity of a fan rivalry. And so this is something I have on the website because everyone loves looking at top 25 lists. And so I put a top 25 list on there. Some of the things I'm working on now, looking at how the promotional titles of rivalries impact our behavior. And so if a person is exposed to a positive title, such as the word friendly in the title, or a negative title, such as the word war in a title, or hate, how do those titles and those logos, how does that impact the way we perceive rival teams, and how does that impact the way we're going to behave toward rival teams? And in particular, our willingness to consider anonymous aggression, because there's some very scary data on people's willingness to consider anonymous aggression toward rival participants and fans. So what we've done, and this study has been going on a long time, we have exposed students and fans of Memphis because they were in a new conference, and also Western Kentucky because they were in a new conference, so they didn't have these long historical ongoing rivalries. We exposed fans to either titles that read the red and blue friendly, because Memphis students indicated Cincinnati as their biggest rival. So some students were exposed to friendly, some students were exposed to the title, the red and blue rivalry, and then others were exposed to this, 481 miles of hate, because there's 481 miles between the cities of Cincinnati and Memphis. And so what we found so far, our preliminary findings are people exposed to this, the word hate, are more negative than people who are exposed to the friendly term or the positive term. So what that means for practitioners is if you're starting a new rivalry, you want people to be excited, but you don't want them to be or get to the point where they're deviant. Because if they're deviant, then other people are seeing that. And so one, you may have legal implications. I mean, we've seen with Brian Stowe and what happened to him in San Francisco. It was a fan of the LA Dodgers who was beat close to death by fans of the Giants. And the Giants subsequently had to pay a large, very, very large sum of money to the Stowe family. So there's some legal ramifications and some financial ramifications, but also think about if you're taking someone to the game, you're taking a young kid to the game, and that's their first game, that's their first experience, and they go to a game labeled 481 miles of hate, and then they see a fight, that could leave a negative impression in their minds, and they never want to go back to that event. And so if you're a practitioner, and you're starting a new relationship with a rival team, it may be fun to refer to this, but you're taking a lot of chances referring to it as something like 481 miles of hate, and you're really driving that level of negativity. And then the thing we're doing right now, which is really fun, is for the dissertation, I collected open-ended questions and just asked people to leave comments about their rival teams. And so people left some very supportive comments of their favorite team, sometimes supportive comments of the rival team. A lot of people left some very, very negative comments of their rival team. And so we, at that time, had categorized the comments into these different categories: acknowledgement, either good, bad, or neutral, supporting the rival or supporting the favorite team. And then here's what we were really interested in. Derogation 1 being low, which is mostly playful, making fun of the rival. 2, moderate, which is the use of stronger language. Or 3, which is high, people using threatening words or wishing harm on someone. And so what we're doing now is we actually have taken those categories and we're compiling comments from ESPN Gamecast for some of the rivalry games throughout the 2016 season. And we're comparing that to the comments people leave on political stories. So looking at when there's a story that's describing the competition between the Republican nominee and the Democrat nominee. What are the comments left in those? And so I just got the first stories today, so I don't have a lot of data. But one thing I did see from this weekend's CU-CSU rivalry game, people were trying to predict what was going to happen in the game, and a CSU fan says Ralphie, which is the CU's Colorado Buffalo mascot, Ralphie dies before halftime, CSU by 10 points. And then this is something that was left on the dissertation. Oregon State fan said I wouldn't cheer for the Ducks if they were playing in Taliban. And I had similar comments such as if Florida were playing, I would cheer if their stadium blew up and everyone in the stadium died. Things like that. And so these are online comments. Hopefully people they're over-exaggerating. But the fact that they're leaving those type of comments, and what we know about anonymous aggression, that when we ask people, how likely are you to consider the most heinous acts of aggression toward a rival team or participant? And those heinous acts are either physically hurt or in some cases murder someone from the favorite or the rival team. It's roughly 1 or 2 to 2% of people say they would strongly consider that most heinous act. So that seems very, very small. However, take into consideration, if you're in a stadium of 100,000 and 1% of the people in there have at least indicated they would definitely be likely to consider that, that's very, very alarming for researchers and especially for practitioners. And so some of the theoretical contributions I feel our work has made is we've added to social identity theory just more information about how groups interact and in-group bias. Schadenfreude, we're currently looking at how Schadenfreude and Gorfing are different, and Gorfing is the competitive aspect of Schadenfreude. We've added some scales to the literature so people can now measure fan perceptions of rival teams, which is very important for people moving forward. Instead of just asking a person, how do you feel about your rival team? Now you have these skills that you can actually use and you get a more rounded view of those perceptions. We've looked at decision making, so we've added to decision making literature as far, especially that fantasy football chapter I talked about earlier, and how rivalry impacts those strategic decisions that a person's going to make. And then also the cognitive evaluation of people when we're looking at logos and titles, and how we evaluate something that we visually see and are auditory. So some of the practical implications for marketers, I feel, are when there are positive ways to promote rivalries. Some positive ways, I'll use Nebraska as an example because they're new to the Big Ten. When Nebraska first joined the Big Ten, the conference administrators they decided Nebraska and Iowa were going to play the final game of the football season. So administrators at the two schools got together and they created what they called the Heroes Game. In that Heroes Game, and I've actually been to two of them, they're a citizen from the state of Nebraska and a citizen from the state of Iowa are recognized for something positive they've done. So the administrators at those two schools are trying to put a positive spin on this rivalry. And so they want people to be excited, but they don't want people to be deviant. And so that's a very positive way to promote a rival. Additionally, Nebraska and Wisconsin, they started playing for the Freedom Trophy this last year. And so that's a way that you have different out-group or in-groups. You have your one favorite team over here, one favorite team over here. But if you're playing for the Freedom Trophy, then you're part of a bigger group, okay? Everyone's part of a larger third in-group. So these are things that organizations have tried to do to be responsible in their promotion of rival games. However, has anyone ever heard of the $5 Bits of Broken Chair Trophy? This is probably the most followed trophy that Nebraska plays for every year. And it started because when Bo Pelini was the coach at Nebraska, someone started a fake account called Faux Pelini on Twitter. And he would send out these funny messages during games and after games anytime. Well, he started a back and forth with the Golden Gopher mascot from the University of Minnesota, and it ended up where the Faux Pellini said, what's our trophy going to be? And he said, it'll be a $5 share. And the Golden Gopher account said, as long as if we win, I can smash it over your head. And Faux Pellini said, okay, that's fine. Hence, the $5 Bits of Broken Chair trophy was born. And so you can see that was a very organic movement. That was something fans did. But look, the University of Minnesota has latched onto it and in some ways started it. But you can see the Golden Gopher with the trophy, and then you can see the current Nebraska football coach with the trophy. So the organizations have followed what the fans are wanting, and they're taking part in this as well, which is very interesting for my beliefs, because fans drive rivalry, but then we have to ask the question: are fans driving rivalry to a more negative place than maybe administrators want rivalry to go? And so that's a very interesting contradiction between what the two parties are trying to do. And then I'll also show some bad or negative promotions of rivalries that I've seen, and I'll use the Grizzlies as an example because I get their news all the time, so I hear about these things. So everyone knows Memphis Grizzlies, they feel the Los Angeles Clippers are a big rival, right? Because they've played several times in the playoffs and everything. And a common nickname for the Clippers is the Los Angeles Floppers, because of the way people say that they play and they try to draw fouls during the game. So one time when the Grizzlies were playing the LA Clippers in Memphis, the organization gave away flip-flops, which is really funny, is really creative, but sends some type of negative or negative sign to the fans that yes, we as an organization believe this team are the floppers as well, and we have a negative perception of these teams. And then it doesn't only happen in Memphis. I just wanted to show another team that I follow, the Denver Nuggets. There's a common, teams always have skits where a person will be wearing a shirt of the rival team or the visiting team, and they're being obnoxious in the fans. And it's usually a worker for the organization. It's not just some random fan, but they're acting obnoxious in the stands. The mascot of the favorite team will come out and they'll silly string the person, and the crowd erupts and goes crazy and everything. And then the last thing is a video that I'm actually not going to show in here, but where during the 2016 NBA playoffs, the Grizzlies organization had a fake San Antonio Spurs mascot that they laid on a table, and everyone knows that Memphis is historically a big wrestling town. Grizz climbed on top of about a 25-foot ladder and jumped and body slammed the fake mascot of the San Antonio Spurs. And so, again, it's something that, is kind of fun, all fun and games, but let's say one of those fans at that game, at the Clippers game, at the Denver game where they sprayed silly string on a Grizzlies fan, or at that playoff game with the San Antonio Spurs, let's say some fan is deviant. What's the organization going to say? The organization is going to say, we don't condone that behavior, we have nothing to do with that, and we don't want that behavior at our games. Well, it's hard to say that when you have these type of promotions. And so my work, I feel, has a very practical implication in that organizations have to be careful the way they're promoting their rival games or their rivalries. And then here's some of the things that I'm working on now and working on in the future. I am working on a different typology of rival, so just where different rivalries fit into as far as interstate, intrastate, television rivalries. We're currently working on a book chapter for fandom and consumer culture, so this is actually outside of sport, but we're working to see some of those differences between Schadenfreude and Gorfing. I've mentioned some of the work I want to do with the website. There's continued work on that, and then I want to create a profile or document a profile of fan rivalries in intercollegiate athletics, professional athletics, and even international sport. This last December of 2015, I hosted the first online forum on sport rivalries, so people from around the world were able to get together. About 14 of us got together that were researching rivalry and share some ideas, some of the things that we're doing. And so we're going to continue that this November, and hopefully at some point actually have a face-to-face conference where we can bring people together. And then I want to write a text on rivalry, which luckily this semester I'm teaching a freshman honors class on rivalry, and so I just went ahead and started writing that text so the class could use it and I could get feedback from the students for those purposes. And so that's a general overview of what I've done, what I plan to do, and I thank you all for listening, and I'm open for questions if anyone has any. If there are no questions, then we will move on to the second portion of the forum. So here's kind of the interactive portion of this.
Actually, is it too late to ask a question? So you said you kind of hold the position that it's the fans who create the rivalry. You gave the one example with the administrators creating the Heroes Trophy. Obviously, my background, my alma mater with the head coach trying to create the rivalry, UConn between UCF. Have you thought of looking into like fan perspectives on that, or is anybody doing that? Former players, current players, whether or not these two schools are perceived as rivals through one person's individual efforts to create a rivalry?
So let me understand. Looking at the way fans feel about the organizations trying to create rivalry.
Or if there is indeed a rivalry there now. Or you have the coaches says there's a rivalry, or do the fans, players believe that there's a rivalry there?
We have not looked at that directly. So we haven't had many instances where there's been a created rival or rivalry, and then we ask people, how do you feel about this? So we could go and we could ask UConn fans, how do you feel about this? We could ask Wisconsin and Nebraska fans, Wisconsin and Iowa fans. One interesting thing that we did, however, was when I talked about the promotional titles and that 481 miles of hate for Memphis and Cincinnati, Western Kentucky students identified Middle Tennessee State as their biggest rival. And so the counterpart to that logo for Memphis was 98 miles of hate between Western Kentucky and Middle Tennessee State. And the colleague I'm working with at Western Kentucky emailed me last football season and he said, hey, it's interesting, the Western Kentucky football players are referring to this rivalry as 100 miles of hate. So immediately I thought, that's really interesting because that's something that I wonder if they were exposed to this.
Sure.
And so they latched onto it. But it also was a little scary because I thought, well, I'm working to try and make sure people don't do this, to diffuse these situations, and I've created this situation possibly. But one other thing I would say on that is I had someone from the Missouri Columbian call me, and they were asking about the Battle Lines rivalry between Arkansas and Missouri. And we talked about how the organizations can promote that, so how that departments should promote that. And the thing I told him is, if you are creating something, you have to make sure fans get behind it. Because if the fans aren't behind it, then it's not going to develop into anything. And so if you're an organization creating something, I would say you at least have to get buy-in from key stakeholders or key fans that are trendsetters. So, but we haven't looked specifically at perceptions of creative rivalries. That'd be very interesting.
So related to that, as far as getting fan buy-in, and it seems like in the Big Ten it happens more often than not. I guess the number of games that are promoted as rivalries or playing for some kind of trophy. Do you know, have fans bought into that? Because it seems like if you get beyond one or two rivalry schools, it's like you're desperately just trying to market the game to get fan interest, because, I mean, do fans get up for, I mean, if you have like 5 or 6 opponents that are promoted as rivals, are the fans gonna have just as much enthusiasm for all of them, or does it just start to look like a marketing gimmick?
We have data that shows people are more likely to consume the rival game when it involves the favorite team and their biggest rival than when it involves the favorite team and a secondary rival. So there is something to suggest that, yeah, at some point it's saturated. People aren't going to get too excited about the game. One really interesting thing about the Big Ten is because that conference is so old and many of those schools have been in that conference so long, those trophies, they were or originated very organically. They had something, it was between fans, and so fans identified with it. And so while you have teams like Michigan and Ohio State, who are usually at the top of the conference, they're really focused primarily on each other. But you have all these other schools that, like Minnesota wants to focus on Wisconsin, and they want to focus on Nebraska and all these other schools that, because people want to favorably compare to someone. And so Minnesota, how many times does Minnesota beat Michigan? How many times do they beat Ohio State? So they need to find all these other schools that they can compare favorably with. What's really interesting is the new schools, I know I mentioned Nebraska, but the new schools like Nebraska, Maryland, and Rutgers, those are more creative rivalries. And so it will take a long time, or our data suggests it will take a long time for fans to really get behind that. And so it may be seen as a marketing ploy, unless there's buy-in on some level.
Is it the same for school rivals between sport disciplines? I mean, it's basketball, it doesn't matter if it's basketball, soccer, football, it's still the same names?
There are differences, and some of the one limitation from what we've done so far is this is primarily focused on football and men's basketball because those are the two revenue sports that most people follow. And so when we ask about rivalry, most people just think football and men's basketball. And so there are situations where teams may have a football rival, but then they have a different rival for women's basketball or women's tennis or something like that. One team that's driven by level of success. I mean, the University of Texas baseball team, they have their rivals within the conference, but then they also see Stanford as a rival because they play every year out of conference. And those two schools historically have been somewhat successful. And so there are differences, yeah.
You talked a lot about Division I schools. I imagine there probably wouldn't be much differences with lower yet more elite levels of competition, such as the renowned Division III in NCAA. I wonder if there would be any differences with the manifestation of rivalry at, say, D3 schools such as Mississippi College or Wheaton.
I knew you were going to get there soon. We've tried to gather information at the FCS level. So I wanted to start at the FBS level because people are very, very passionate about that, and it's easy to get the fan basis. We've tried to go to the FCS level, and we've had a lot of difficulty getting people to respond. I do want to go down to different levels, and as you know, I mean, whenever we write, that's one of the future studies is looking at different competitive settings. I want to look at lower divisions. I want to look at women's athletics, but also professional athletics, or international athletics as well. And so I don't know if it would manifest itself differently. What I will say is looking at social identity theory, looking at Schadenfreude, in-group bias, the literature would say there wouldn't be that great of a difference, that it wouldn't manifest itself significantly different than at the largest level, because we're still trying to compare ourselves against an outgroup, and there's still that how there's still that phenomenon in how we treat each other.
Second question, this might get into the roundtable, but I know this is obviously more sport, specifically amateur, professional sport. What about tying in with hospitality? What is there, and this is where you guys can maybe speak to this. She's not. The hospitality folks can speak more to, I mean, competition between resorts, hotels. I don't know how rivalry would manifest itself in that setting, but I assume you've thought about that, or maybe that's for the roundtable discussion. I don't know.
One thing that actually does lead into the roundtable. Figured people were asking questions, so we didn't get to the roundtable. But one thing Radesh and I have talked about is how likely are people to stay at a hotel that they know their favorite team stays at when they go on the road? How likely are they to stay at a hotel that they know a rival team stays at? And does that make any difference? Or is it all price point? Because as we've seen with goods and services, a lot of it has to do with price point. But we don't entirely know that. And so I'm trying to develop a way to measure that. Because the first difficulty I'm finding is people don't, at least in intercollegiate athletics, they don't have an official hotel, usually. They have an official hotel in their hometown, but when they go on the road, there's not an official hotel. And so it typically changes again by price point and where they can stay the cheapest. And then because of that, a lot of fans don't know. They don't know where, when Kansas comes into town, how many people are going to know where the Kansas team is staying in 2 weeks, unless they're staying at the hotel that we all see them. So that's something that we've talked about, but there's a lot of roadblocks to doing that.
You spoke about fan behavior and intergroup bias. I'm just interested to know if you feel like on a professional level, if rivalry, if it happens to have an impact on political issues and fan support for athletes or their athletic teams. Do you think that's something that can kind of go into rivalry? I'm thinking about the Kaepernick situation because it made me think about that instantly when you spoke about it.
It would seem that, we saw immediately that they were playing the Chargers the next week.
Mm-hmm.
And the Chargers organization, they had a military night when they played the 49ers. And so that was an immediate reaction to that. And the Chargers fans had an immediate reaction to Kaepernick. And those two teams consider themselves rivals on some level. And so there's some support for that in popular culture. At least I'm not sure empirically. There haven't been too many of those situations where we've been able to collect data on it. But I could definitely see that phenomenon occurring. What's really interesting about Kaepernick is now you're having more and more sport personalities join his cause. And so if you're a fan who wants to derogate him for his stance, well now maybe you're going to have a player on your favorite team doing the same thing. And so then it brings into question, how do they control for that? They don't support the cause, but they support their favorite team. What are they going to do? They'll probably find some way to separate the two. I think
Cognitive dissonance or something along those lines?
Yeah, they'll have some type of cognitive dissonance for that. So we have successfully run out of time. We don't have to talk about what we're currently doing. But thank you everyone for making the time coming to the first meeting. Our second meeting is in the beginning of October, and Dong Hee is going to speak at the second meeting. So thank you everyone for your time.